Wednesday, April 27, 1881. The New York Times. Burned in a factory fire. Curious accidents attending the conflagration. One man certainly dead, 2 others missing, 17 persons injured. The accidents that succeeded each other. The box factory of Edward C. Smith on the Greenpoint shore of Newtown Creek was burned to the ground yesterday. 1 man perished in the flames, 2 others are reported missing, and the list of injured persons includes the names of 17 men and boys. Of these, 1 man and a boy are not expected to live. The injuries are chiefly burns, traceable to an explosion in an outbuilding after the fire was well under control. A crowd of spectators had collected at this point to witness the operations of the firemen. Had the police arrangements been what they should have been, the list of the injured would have been lessened by at least a dozen. Smith's factory has a frontage of 150 feet on Box Street and 200 on Oakland Avenue. A narrow alley known as Ash Street separates it from Newtown Creek, and a piece of marshy land bounds it on the east. It was of wood and 3 stories in height. On the premises were a brick engine house, a stable, and a lofty frame building, detached from the factory and used for the storage of sawdust, from the sale of which, in this as in all the other Greenpoint box factories, some thousands of dollars were derived yearly. In the factory yard were piled many thousand feet of pine timber. The ground floor of the factory was chiefly devoted to the resawing of the lumber. On the second floor, a large force of men was employed in making boxes by hand. The manufacture of boxes by machinery was almost entirely done on the top floor. About 200 men and 50 boys were employed, the latter force being about equally divided as helpers between the men on the first and third floors. Fully 30 million feet of lumber were used up annually, representing a daily average of 15,000 boxes. The most of these boxes were delivered to the Standard Oil Works. This is the busiest season, and the workmen were employed from early morning until 7 o'clock every night. Across Oakland Avenue are the extensive saleratus works of Reeves and Church, and a short distance up the creek the oil works of the Brooklyn Refining Company. The streets in the vicinity are chiefly built up with frame tenement houses, and altogether the neighborhood can furnish material for a conflagration that would desolate this end of Greenpoint and destroy property valued at millions. At 10 o'clock yesterday morning, a boy ran breathlessly into the office of the Brooklyn Crosstown Railroad Company and urged the secretary, Mr. John R. Connor, to give an alarm from the firebox on the building, as there was a big fire going on in the shaving room of Smith's box factory. The latter is a long block from the railroad office. The boy admitted that nobody had given him instructions for such a step, and Mr. Connor, believing the story to be an idle rumor, declined to strike the alarm, and as the statement was not corroborated later, he paid no further attention to the matter. It was subsequently learned, although Mr. Smith and the superintendent, Charles Pinkham, denied any knowledge of the fact, that a fire was actually in progress at this time in the factory shaving room. This was a large apartment on the Box Street side of the building, in which were stored the shavings and other refuse used in feeding the engine fires. The experience of most manufacturers of boxes is that this shaving room is almost as dangerous as a powder magazine would be on their premises. Its contents are as dry as tinder, and a spark will start a fire that will spread like a flash. For this reason, the shaving room is generally a detached building kept under constant watch. The shaving room of Reeves and Church in Freeman Street has been burned twice within a few years, but the flames were confined to the isolated building used for the storage of this combustible material, and the firm were saved a heavy loss in consequence. No such precaution had been taken at Smith's factory, the shaving room being under the roof of the main building. It also adjoined the engine room. The fire yesterday morning was extinguished, as it was supposed, and attracted so little attention on the premises that many of the workmen were in entire ignorance of its occurrence. Its origin is not known. The dinner hour was from 12 to 12:45 o'clock, and when the whistle sounded, the men left their work, those who lived in the neighborhood to go to their homes, the others to various parts of the factory, where they generally congregated to lunch and chat together. It is generally supposed that some of the sparks of the morning's fire fell among the sawdust, either in the shaving room or near it, and lay smoldering until about this time, 12:30, when they burst into flames. The vigilance of everybody appears to have been relaxed during the dinner hour, and before the flames were discovered, they were eating their way rapidly up through the building. The attention of the workmen on the top floor was attracted to the fire by the smoke coming up the elevators. They supposed the whole floor beneath them was on fire, and panic-stricken, many of them made a rush for the nearest windows, out of which they leapt into the street below. The distance was not great, and the most of them escaped with slight bruises and sprains. One of them, Samuel Nixon, jumped down the elevator and was dragged out unconscious by workmen who were fleeing from the first floor. 6 men were fortunate enough to select a window which overlooked a shed, and by dropping to its roof, escaped without a scratch. Those nearest the stairways plunged down the steps and thus gained the street. The employees on the second floor, though hardly less frightened, generally sought the stairs in their flight, while those on the first floor were among the first outside the factory yard. It was generally believed among the men last night that some of their associates must have been caught in the flames, which spread with startling rapidity, and thus been destroyed. The names of 2 were mentioned, of whom no information whatever could be learned. George Bloomfield, a boxmaker 23 years of age, went into the stable on the Ash Street side of the factory a few minutes before 12 o'clock to sleep off the effects of a spree. Shortly after the fire was discovered John Morford, the factory truckman, learned this fact and endeavored to make his way into the building, but the heat and smoke drove him off, and Bloomfield, who was probably asleep at the time, was burned to death. Detective Looney and Officer Reed afterward found his body, the features charred beyond recognition, and the limbs burned to a crisp. 4 alarms were sent out, one after another, in quick succession, and within half an hour, the whole fire department of Greenpoint and Williamsburg, 10 engines, and 3 hook and ladder companies, was on the ground. Another engine and truck from Brooklyn were added to the force, a part of which devoted its energies to extinguishing the flames, while the remainder turned streams on the tenement houses, the saleratus factory, and the piles of lumber. A slight breeze was blowing, which fanned the flames and scattered a shower of sparks on the surrounding property. The employees of the Brooklyn Refining Company were stationed in readiness to pass buckets of water along to any point that might be threatened, and the fire hose was used in wetting down the buildings. Many of the tenement house occupants moved their furniture into the street and stood guard over it until all danger of a general conflagration had passed. The flames leapt from the factory across Ash Street and quickly ate out the interior of the American Flag House, a 3-story brick structure which many years ago was a popular public house. The tenants managed to save the larger part of their property. A small 2-story frame house adjoining was also burned. At the end of an hour and a half, the firemen, after a hard struggle, had brought the fire under control. Up to this time, the sawdust house had been kept pretty well soaked with water. The heat had been so great, however, that the dry woodwork under the eaves now took fire. A squad of men, from engine number 15 raised a ladder and were in the act of carrying hose to the roof when there was a terrific explosion within the building and they were hurled to the ground. The building was connected with the factory by a subterranean passageway through which was carried the sawdust for storage as fast as it accumulated in the factory. Somebody had lifted the trap door of this passageway, which is situated close to the sawdust building. Almost immediately the explosion occurred. The exact cause of it is unexplained. Those who happened to be watching operations at this point say that a sheet of flame darted through this passageway from the factory, ripping open its top and tearing up the earth in its course. The force of the explosion blew out a large door on the ground floor, scattering splinters of wood and a cloud of burning sawdust in every direction. On a pile of lumber directly in front of this door, and not 20 feet away, was a crowd of about 30 spectators. The police had overlooked this point in drawing their lines around the fire, and the knot of boys and men were left undisturbed to themselves. They were caught in this cloud, and hardly one of them escaped severe burns. Ambulances were summoned, and they were removed to St. Catharine's Hospital. William Crawford, the driver of the truck, in his fall from the ladder, had his jaw broken, and John Flood, fireman, received an ugly gash on the forehead. The third fireman escaped without injury. The names of those injured by the explosion and the extent of their injuries are as follows. Clapp, George J., age 30, of number 560 DuPont Street, face and hands. Clark, John, age 25, of 208 Green Street, face and hands. Frisky, August, age 35, of number 203 Green Street, probably fatally burned. McGlory, George, age 10, of number 91 North 5th Street, face. Ingersoll, George, age 9, of number 408 Manhattan Avenue, hands. Kenna, Patrick, aged 18, of 6th Street, Hunters Point, face and hands. McMuller, Frank, age 9, of number 9 Greenpoint Avenue, face and hands. O'Connor, John, age 12, of number 121 Manhattan Avenue, face, arms, and hands. Renner, John, aged 50, of number 240 Franklin Street, face and hands. Sweeney, William, aged 14, of number 63 Green Street, probably fatally injured. Vandewater, William, aged 20, of Avenue C, between 11th and 12th Streets, this city, face and hands. Those who were injured in leaping from the windows were the following. Bilsger, George, aged 42, of number 22 East 4th Street, this city, thigh broken and his body badly burned. Kenner, John, aged 50, of number 112 Eagle Street, whose ankles were both fractured. Nixon, Samuel, aged 48, of number 138 DuPont Street, injured internally and bruised all over his body. Schaaf, Peter, aged 57, of number 143 Shoal Street, both legs broken and bruised about his body. Frisky and Kenner were removed to their own homes. The names of the two men reported missing are Joseph Brockman, aged 40, and married, a printer, employed in stamping boxes, who lived in Huron Street, and Patrick McLaughlin, aged 38, single, who lived in Eagle Street. McLaughlin was employed on the second floor of the factory. In addition to the above list of accidents, the police report that Foreman Fanning of engine number 15 was kicked in the breast by an unruly horse, which he was unhitching from the engine, and James Hewitt, age 45, of number 44 North 5th Street, was knocked down by the fire supply wagon on its way to the fire and had his right ankle fractured. Mr. Smith estimates the loss on his factory, machinery, and 100,000 feet of lumber stored in the yard at $75,000. He is insured for $45,000 in 50 companies. The owner of the American Flag House is a Mr. Dunham of this city, whose loss is $2,000. John Barnett, the owner of the frame dwelling adjoining, fixes his loss at $1,500, on which there is no insurance.